Hey, what's up you guys, the Curious Owl here, and today I am bringing you my September 2021 wrap-up. Okay, so first and foremost, I would like to address the fact that we are in a new space. I have many more shelves than I normally do, and we're in a new room because if you guys did not watch the short video I put out a couple weeks ago, Robert and I finally moved into a new house. We found a new rental not far from my family that is very close to him for work that ended up just falling into our lap pretty literally. Like, it was very sudden when we had to move. There is a window right here, which is why you can see this like little sunspot, whatever the crap you want to call it. And this is kind of the one thing I'm not really jazzed about when it comes to filming, but I think this might be a good spot as far as sitting down, and I may change the way I'm sitting up against these shelves every now and then, so don't expect it to be super consistent for a little bit until I can find the best spot for me to film, because with that window, it's really hard to film during the day, and it also gets very warm in here, so if I ever get to a point in these videos where I start breathing kind of heavily, it's because it's very warm up here and I have to have the windows open, which is also why you'll hear stuff from the outside like birds and stuff like that, because it just gets very freaking hot. But with that said, let's get started with how September went. So September was the month for Bookopoly-thon, as well as the new Magical Readathon focusing around the story of going to Aurelium Academy. Now, out of everything I read in September and has set for my TBR, the only thing I did not get to was actually the book I was fairly certain I was not going to get to at all, which was The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. Now, I did slate this for one of my Magical Readathon prompts, but I completed everything else in the Magical Readathon this past month, so it wasn't a huge deal that I didn't get to this one. The thing was that this was supposed to be a slow read with my husband, and we haven't really had a chance to sit and read together because, unfortunately, his job requires him to work long hours for 5 days a week, and especially with this very sudden move at the end of September, it was really important for us to focus on that. And he is not a huge reader, which is why it was going to be a slower read, because he's not someone who, like me, is going to sit and read whenever I get the chance to. He's very much somebody who has to be very in the mood to read, but he had wanted to start The Way of Kings with me because he was actually interested in it and had purchased the first 3 books in the series that were in a box set. So unfortunately we didn't get to that, but I think I may try to start it sometime, if not in October, then in November, because of the fact that October already kind of at this point, now over a full week into the month, has kind of been shot for me in terms of my reading. I've been in a very slumpy mood, mostly because of the fact that I was moving over the last week and unpacking and everything, so I haven't had a lot of time to read. But I would say that Bookopoly-thon was successful, Magical Readathon was successful, my D20 TBR was successful. I pretty much read everything this month except for The Way of Kings, which was absolutely amazing. So let's get into the stats for the month. So as far as page count, we had a total of 2,575 pages read, because we read a total of 11 books this month. 11 books. I think that's not necessarily my highest, but I had a lot of help because there were several books on this TBR that were fairly short. We also listened to 27 hours, 56 minutes, and 24 seconds worth of audiobooks. I read 10 books that were physical, 1 was an audiobook, and 10 of the books were from my physical library, and 1 was a borrowed book that I had. Then as far as star ratings, I had a total of 4 5-star books this month. I also had 4 4-star ratings this month, and then I had 3 3-star ratings this month. So overall, not too shabby. Everything again has been a 3-star or above. The first one I ended up reading was Snot Girl Volume 1 by Brian Lynn O'Malley and Leslie Hung. This is a graphic novel series that talks about a young woman whose name is Lottie. I couldn't remember her name off the top of my head. That's actually a pretty interesting, accurate representation of how the first 2 volumes of this series were for me. So Snot Girl Volume 1 ended up getting, and actually Snot Girl Volume 2, because I read them pretty much back to back, both of these ended up getting 3 stars, because as much as I liked the character of Lottie as a person and the fact that there was something a little different about her, where she was kind of a social media influencer and she had a fashion blog and had this really interesting personality, and she had this deep dark secret of the fact that she didn't want people to know about the fact fact she had allergies because she thinks it would ruin her, you know, social media influence. But I felt like the plot that was kind of underlying the whole thing was really confusing and choppy, which for most graphic novels, choppy is not necessarily a bad thing because there's usually multiple perspectives and you have to really look at different angles of the entire scope of the world, like with Monstrous by Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda. But in this instance, with the underlying plot starts off in the first volume, Green Hair Don't Care, where Lottie meets this other woman who is basically like an up-and-coming fashion blogger. She's getting to be really popular and decides to befriend Lottie. And Lottie has been taking this new allergy medication that's supposed to help her, but she kind of blacks out. And the next thing she sees is that this young woman is murdered in the bathroom, and Lottie has her blood basically all over her. So I thought that that was a really cool concept at the start of it. I really like that idea that, you know, we don't really know whether or not Lottie actually killed her. We don't know if Lottie is an unreliable narrator of sorts or an unreliable character. But when it came to the overall construction of the story from that point and then going into the second volume, which is called California Screaming, it just seemed like it was thrown together without the real purpose of being the actual, like, underlying plot. Because in the course of all of this, Lottie is still obviously trying to keep up appearances. She's still trying to, you know, kind of get this whole thing squared away where she's, you know, still a social media influencer. There's a whole perspective with a cop who kind of has an interest in Lottie, and he's like a fashion blogger finder. He's like a cult follower of fashion bloggers, specifically Lottie. If what I am saying makes no sense to you, that is literally how I felt with this. I really enjoyed the art style. I loved the concept of involving a murder mystery within this and an otherwise fairly tame kind of story, but it just was so confusing, and I don't understand whether or not there should have actually been this plot. I feel like it should have either stayed tame or go full hog with the murder mystery, and it tried to balance both, and it just didn't work at all. The next thing I read was Shine Your Icy Crown by Amanda Lovelace. This is Amanda Lovelace's not newest collection, because just recently, like a couple of days ago, her newest collection was released, but this was the one that was out before, I think earlier this year. I want to say it was like January when this came out. This is the second installment in a series that is called
Editing Gabby here. So I say the title wrong here and I cut it out specifically because I said it wrong, but the series title that Shine Your Icy Crown is under is called You Are Your Own Fairy Tale.
Basically, these poetry collections she creates based around this idea with women or some kind of magic is the idea that basically they take the story of some kind of Disney princess, in this one in particular, Elsa, and essentially creates a poetry collection, a story surrounding around that idea. And there's various trigger warnings within this that actually are listed in the beginning, such as child abuse, toxic relationships, sexual assault, eating disorders, mental illness, self-harm, sexism, suicide, trauma, and possibly more. And the thing that I love about Amanda Lovelace is that every single one of her poetry collections are 5 stars, this one included. I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars. Because while the poetry is very much a flash poetry kind of style, similar to like Rupi Kaur or any other very big poetry person that is out now, Amanda really just creates a very interesting story that is inspired by the Disney princesses. Like I said, this one is kind of more focused on Elsa, and the collection that was before this, called Break Your Glass Slippers, was inspired by Cinderella. And similar to how that collection ended up being, this one was very much centered around the idea of looking at these characters and the different aspects of them in terms of their personalities, and really grounding them to real life people who go through these various things time and time again, with things like sexual abuse, assaults, you know, bullying, sexism, anything you can think of, especially when it comes to women, not just, you know, anybody in general, but specifically women. And I really adore how Amanda has so many lines in here that are super, super powerful. And then breaking up sections, there's this beautiful artwork that is involved to kind of separate the sections of the poetry collection. I just never find anything to fault with Amanda Lovelace's writing. She is my favorite poet by far. I also have an oracle deck that she created that isn't like inspired by her, you know, own witchy path that I absolutely adore. It is one of my favorite decks I've ever owned, and I think it is very well in tune with myself. The next book I completed was Vampire Academy Academy by Rochelle Mead, which, if you are not aware, I am doing a reread/finish series of the Vampire Academy series because I read the first 2 books of this, I want to say either at the end of my high school career and or beginning of my college life, and I really, really liked it. I loved the first one, and I loved the second one a lot more, but I never continued the series. And this was a series I remember so many people loving when I was like in high school specifically, and I was really impressed with how this one went. I do have a review for this book if you would like to check that out, because I don't want to spend too much time on it since I already have a video made for it, but short, sweet, to the point, 5 stars. Was really impressed with it, and I was really surprised with how much was packed into this story that I don't think I caught the first time I read it when I was younger, that I think I appreciate so much more now as an adult. The next book I read was a book I borrowed from a friend of mine, which is called The Wives of Henry VIII by Antonia Fraser. This is basically a historical book that talks about the different wives of Henry VIII, as you know. Honestly, this was interesting, but I have such a hard time reading nonfiction, especially historical text. I have a very hard time with it because, especially with this one, it was very pedantic. It felt like Antonia was trying to reach to audiences, I think, that were very already familiar with the Tudor, era, and especially with Henry VIII. And this was just definitely something that I think would probably be for the more advanced reader of historical content, not somebody like me who very rarely will pick up a book like this. But my friend recommended it to me because at the time that she recommended it, I was working on a story that involved one of the wives of Henry VIII, and so she had read this and said, it's really hard to get through, but because it's very, obviously high caliber, high brow kind of writing, it would definitely be worth your while to read it, just for the pure research aspect. And since then, the idea I had for that story has been tabled. It's been very hard to really grasp an idea of what I want to do with that story, so I just kind of tabled it, but I still read this because I was genuinely interested. I've always been fascinated with the Henry VIII era, especially when it came to the different wives, and this was basically telling the life story of each of the wives from when, they were born to when they got married to Henry, and then ultimately either their divorcing or their demise, essentially. So I give it a 3-star because, again, I feel like the pedanticness of it just really made it hard for me to get through the book, but I managed, and, I finished it. The next book I ended up reading was Descender Volume 1 by Jeff Lemire and Dustin Nguyen. This is a sci-fi kind of dystopian graphic novel series, and it follows this little boy who's a robot, and his name is Tim 21. And essentially what we learn at the very beginning of this is that there was a time in the very far future of Earth where robots and androids were obviously really, really helpful with getting everything done around the world, but there were these planets or planetary robots, something to that effect, that came and basically destroyed Earth. And so the humans decided that the androids were partially to blame because they were overrun by these entities that came and destroyed the Earth. And so they decided that any android that basically was living at that point was to be destroyed. Now, Tim 21, unfortunately, had just been basically sent off to help take care of a little boy, and when this happened, he was shut off and nobody knew he was alive. Jumped about 10 years later, and he finally awakens, and so now, because he's awakened, basically beacon lights are going off to various people who don't even know he's alive. And so you've got at least 3 different camps of people that are trying to find Tim 21 to either save him or basically kill him and use him for scrap. So that's basically the gist of this. I don't want to get too much more into that because unfortunately that would go through and spoil especially the ending, but it's very, very good. I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars. I loved Tim so much. He's such a strong little guy, and I was so impressed with how grown up he felt. I mean, he's an android, but he still has kind of the mind of a 10-year-old boy, if that makes sense. And so he's very unaware of how everything's gone, and especially because he's been asleep for 10 years, he doesn't know what's happened. He's looking for essentially his brother and his mother who took him and took care of him, and he lived with, and all these things, and he's noticing that they're gone because likely they were killed in the original catastrophe that had happened. And so it's just really heartbreaking, but also very interesting because especially the end of this, I was left kind of perplexed in the terms of the fact that there was another group that came up that wanted Tim that we were very unaware of who they were, and we don't know anything about them. So I will be hopefully reading the rest of this in October if I can get to it, as well as the sequel series to this, which is called Ascender. The next book I read was my next book in my Stephen King reading series and Dark Tower reading series, which is The Song of Susanna by Stephen King. This is book 6 in the series. I don't want to go through too much of this because I do have a reading vlog review of this, and also because this is the 6th book in this series, it is going to contain a lot of spoilers for people, especially who have not read the Dark Tower series. I will leave the video in the description and in the cards of this video for your perusal if you choose to watch it, but short, sweet, to the point, I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. I really liked it. I feel like the length of it was really weird because this book was only just over 400 pages, and just the way that it was paced, it honestly felt like it was way shorter than that. I don't know how to explain it. It was just bizarre, and I really liked the content of it. I just felt like this should have been a little bit longer, and I felt like this went by way too quick for me, which I was a little distraught by, because a lot of times either a book is way too slow or the book is just way too long and should have been cut off at some other point. So I've not really had a book before this that ever made me feel like it was going way too quick. So it's a first for me, for sure. The next 2 books I read were The Haunted and The Unleashed by Daniel Vega. Now, The Haunted series is basically a duology where, after going through a really traumatic experience with a boy in her hometown that she was involved with, Hendrik's family decides to uproot her and her baby brother to a small town in upstate New York. And they move into this house that a lot of people basically think as like a haunted house. The house, called Steel House, is the site where, unfortunately, a little girl was murdered, supposedly by her older brother, and then that brother then committed suicide in that house. And there is a lot of stuff that is surrounding around that house that is very mysterious, and Hendrix, immediately upon living at that house, starts to notice that things are very dark in that house. There's a very negative force that is there, and tries to enlist some of the people she goes to school with that into basically trying to exorcise this demon. But a lot of people don't really seem to understand that this is a true thing. Everybody kind of thinks it's just, some kind of joke, essentially. And one of her neighbors is actually one of the brothers of the little girl that is still living. He's the only son left out of the 3 kids that, were around, and everybody looks at him as kind of this outcast because since his older brother was the one that killed their sister, they all think that, hey, Eddie is basically just the same and he's crazy and that he's a psycho and he will kill people. And it doesn't help the fact, too, that he kind of keeps to himself and is, very dark and brooding. But Hendrix obviously is very interested in him, despite also being interested in another boy named Connor that she goes to school with. Along with that, though, with all this stuff, Hendrix is still reeling from this very, very traumatic experience she had with her ex-boyfriend, Grayson, and it really permeates a lot of the story of The Haunted because she starts thinking that a lot of what she's suffering from is PTSD and anxiety. So there are massive trigger warnings for that, as well as, like I said, murder and suicide and exorcisms. It's a very dark duology, but I really liked it a lot. I felt that The Haunted in particular was a 4-star for me, was just a little bit too quick. I kind of think that these should have just been one book because I gave both a 4-star, mostly because I liked the stories a lot. I really liked Daniel Vega's writing, and this was not as gory as I think her Merciless series was. Still very creepy and atmospheric. This whole thing was just really, really quick and very easy to fly through, but it made me feel a little unsatisfied because I really had wanted, especially the ending of this, to basically pick up right at the beginning of where this was, if that makes sense. So I wanted these two both to be one singular book because it was so closely related, and I felt that the way that the pacing of the story was, it made sense to have these as one book as opposed to 2 separate ones. At the same time, the events that happened in The Unleashed are slightly different, where this is immediately following the events of what happens in The Haunted, and I can't really say what happens in this though, because it does spoil the ending of The Haunted. So all I can say is that The Unleashed basically takes a massive turn where a whole other slew of problems in terms of what Steel House is and the energy surrounding around it is super important in this one. Like, there's a lot more going on in Steel House that we learn about in The Unleashed as opposed to The Haunted. The next book I ended up reading was The Marionettes by Katie Wismer. This is an indie author and booktuber that I really enjoy. Katie actually is a very amazing person. I look up to her a lot because she actually worked on a book that I have been writing since I was in high school and was absolutely amazing with her feedback. And so I really wanted to support her by picking up this book, which is her newest release, and is the start to a new adult paranormal series that follows this young woman named Valerie Darkmoor. She is a blood witch, and essentially in this world, the Marionettes are a coven of witches of a sort, where every witch can possibly have different powers, but they all are under the employ of the vampires of this world, and essentially it's an urban fantasy of sorts too, because you see the humans involved in this world as well, serving the vampires in some capacity. Now, Valerie, unfortunately, what we learn at the very beginning of the book is that her magic is somehow being stunted. She doesn't know necessarily what's happening, but after becoming under the employ of, in particular, the vampire prince of this world, she starts to realize that things are becoming much more darker and things are going very haywire, which is not the best timing because at the time that this is all happening, she's also coming up on what are called her trials, which are basically the way that she's able to graduate from her schooling and be placed under the employ of a particular vampire. The reason she's under Prince Reginald is because during these trials, all the marionettes get paired up with a vampire to work with to see if they're able to work with the vampires and think on their feet. And a lot of times the vampires will also throw in random things to aid in their trials. So basically Valerie is not only trying to split her time with this prince, but try to figure out why her magic's being stunted. And there's other dark and mysterious things that happen over the course of this book that she's trying to find answers for. I really enjoyed it. Like, this is one of those books, again, like with Song of Susanna, where the content of this book flew by so quick for me. In comparison to Song of Susanna, Marionettes was more so something I was excited to fly by super quick because the content of it just felt like it was exactly the right amount, but it felt like it was supposed to be a 400-page book as opposed to more like just over 200. Like, the way that the story read and the pacing of it honestly felt like it was originally like, 400 pages, but you look at the page count and see how short it is, and you're like, how does somebody pack this much content into this short of amount of time? Like, it was astounding, and it was absolutely wonderful to the point where I am so excited for the second book to come out in December, and I think when it comes out, I am buying it like immediately and reading it because I am so excited. I need to know what happens next in this series, and I cannot wait to see what Katie has in store in Wicked Souls. I'm so excited, and it honestly makes me want to go read her more new adult contemporaries that she came out with earlier this year and last year because I have not read them as of yet. Because if I really like her paranormal urban fantasy stuff, I think I'm going to really like her new adult contemporaries. I think that there is no doubt in my mind I'm going to enjoy them because honestly, like, her writing is so good. I can't sing her praises enough. And she's such a kind person as it is that I'm not surprised. Like, this woman can do no wrong in my eyes, honestly. And then finally, my audiobook I read this month, the only one I read because it was the only one that was on my TBR that was available as an audiobook, was The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. I really liked this. I gave it a 4 to 5 stars because honestly there were some points where I thought was a little dragging, but this book was absolutely amazing. I understand completely why people say this is a staple when it comes to fantasy, because this is literally just reading the origin story of a character who in this world is very well known, has been through a ton of shit, and you're literally learning about his entire life as he's telling it to this scribe. And it was just everything I had wanted from this kind of a fantasy story. I had no idea what it was about going into it. I went in completely blind, and I honestly think that that was the best way for me to go about this. I think if I had known going into it anything about what was the real story with it, I think I would not have liked it as much. But I love Kvothe so much. He is just so strong, and he's been through so much. Like, I swoon over this guy because he's just an incredible person, and the amount of growth that you see, especially when he gets to the academy, like, just I can't even put into words how much I loved them. I think if you're any fan of high fantasy, especially if you're looking to, you know, really step up your game, this is definitely one you will want to read, because if you love origin stories, if you are very much somebody who is a very character-driven person, this is something you would like to read. Now, I will go through quickly and let you guys know what they completed in terms of Bookopoly-thon and the Magical Readathon. First, let's go over my D21s. So for my backlist prompt, Vampire Academy was the one to read, which was obviously completed. Then Snack Girl Volume 1 and Volume 2 both completed contemporary prompts that I had for D20, and my standalone prompt I had was The Wives of Henry VIII. Now, in terms of the Magical Readathon of Aurelium, for the Ashthorn Tree, which was a tempting book, I picked Shine Your Icy Crown. For Mist of Solitude, which was a standalone, I picked The Wives of Henry VIII. For Ruin of the Sky, which was about ghosts, etc., we have The Haunted by Daniel Vega. For Obsidian Falls, which was to read a thriller or mystery, I picked The Unleashed by Daniel Vega. For Tower of Rumination, which was a 5-star prediction, I picked Song of Susanna. Then for the Aurelium arc, which was to read a book in a school setting, I picked Vampire Academy. And then for my character picks, I picked a character that was from an urban area, which was to read a book that was placed in a city, which was Snot Girl Volume 1. Then for the continent that I was from, I picked Carador, which was to read a book from an ongoing series, which was the Marionettes, because this is the first book in the series. And then for my race, which I picked an elf, I was to read a book with moon or stars on the cover, and for that I picked Descender Volume 1. Then for Bookopoly-thon, for a book that had gods, I ended up picking the Marionettes. For the prompt for color, I picked Snack Girl Volume 1. For time of day, I picked The Dark Tower, Song of Susanna. And for feed scroll, I ended up going with Vampire Academy. And then for a book that was highest rated on my TBR, that was The Name of the Wind. So these are all the books I ended up reading in the month. I was actually really impressed, like I said, that I read all of these. I did not expect to read all of them, but considering that 4 of them were fairly, you know, short things as far as graphic novels or poetry, and then I had The Haunted and The Unleashed, which were really quick, and I was able to get through Song of Susanna through audio, and Vampire Academy was just a really fun read. Like, I really had no issue with getting through all these books. But let me know what you guys ended up reading in September. Did you complete your reads for Magical Readathon or Bookopoly-thon? Did you participate in them? Did you participate in any other readathons that happened in September that I missed out on? And also let me know what you guys have planned for October now that we're more than a week in. Do you guys have plans for Halloween? My husband and I are actually going to be going to a concert on the 30th for our anniversary, and I'm really excited because this is a concert we've gone to several years in a row for our dating anniversary, because our dating anniversary was November 5th, and obviously this concert was very much a Halloween concert, and we didn't get to go last year because of COVID, and I'm so excited that we get to go this year because I miss it so much. Anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me in this video. If you guys did enjoy it, please do give it a big thumbs up, and if you haven't already and you'd like to be and would like to see more content like this, go ahead and hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock, and I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye guys!